I'm David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. The nuclear submarine deal signed this week by Anthony Albanese, Joe Biden and Rishi Sunak marks a big shift and a sharp focus on whether China poses a threat. Australia won't get its first nuclear submarine for another decade, but the image of three leaders deepening their alliance sent an unmistakable message of intent. The AUKUS partners are boosting their collective capacity to patrol, defend and strike in the increasingly contested waters to our north. Back home, ministers fanned out to spruik the jobs benefits, and the coalition offered solid bipartisan support. All was going well, until a Labor icon weighed in. Paul Keating launched a full-scale attack on the AUKUS deal and those who put it together. There were the trademark insults, but also a fundamental disagreement over the need to go down this path at all. The former Prime Minister does not think China poses a threat. From Anthony Albanese down, government ministers hit back. Paul Keating, they say, is still living with a benign 1990s view, ignoring what China has become. The Defence Minister, Richard Marles, joins me later in the program. But first to our panel, Greg Sheridan, Laura Tingle and Peter Harcher.
Hey, David.
Probably a good starting point for the conversation. Greg, why do we need nuclear submarines? Why are they a better option for Australia than conventional subs?
Well, it's a fantastic move. I had been a bit of a sceptic of AUKUS because I thought the subs were too far away. If we'd just gone that British-style program, we wouldn't get our first sub till 2045 or whatever. The brilliance of this deal is that we get Virginia subs halfway through their life, so we know they work perfectly. Now, why do we need them? We haven't had any long-range strike since the F-111. It's everyone agrees, the most dangerous strategic environment we've faced since World War II because of China's radical militarisation and extreme aggressiveness. The nuclear sub is a different quality of weapon to anything else we'll have. It's an asymmetric weapon, can do enormous damage, it's very hard to guard against. You don't know where it is. The modern nuclear subs have vertical launch cells. They can launch any kind of missile to hit any target in the world. The new ones will be able to launch hypersonic missiles in due course. They massively complicate the thinking of any potential aggressor. They're not conventional subs on steroids. They're a completely different kind of weapon. So they allow us to defend ourselves, they allow us to help our neighbours, and they allow us to provide with the Americans a stable system of deterrence in the region, which is the best chance of avoiding war.
I mean, this capacity to have submarines lurking a lot further away for a lot longer. You mentioned China. Is that what this is about?
Well, everything is characterised by China because, you know, everything Keating said the other day was completely crackers. But one thing that he said was that America wished China had remained poor. America, like all of the West, has put a massive effort into drawing China into the global economy, drawing it into global institutions. But China, especially since Xi Jinping has become president, has taken a path of radical aggression, bullying of its neighbours. It has abolished all the internal institutionalism, so it's now a one-man dictatorship like Putin in Russia. It is building nuclear weapons faster than any other state. It is building nuclear submarines. Now,
that's all true, but is it a threat? And this, and we will get more to the Paul Keating critique. But does that mean it's a threat to Australia or indeed our sea lanes?
Well, military planning has to plan against capability rather than intent. China is saying it's not a threat. But remember, Xi Jinping promised Barack Obama he would not militarise South China Sea Islands. He's done exactly that. They've had border incursions against India and stolen territory. The Australian intelligence agencies believe, with overwhelming evidence, that they want to create a military base in the South Pacific. That would radically compromise our national interests.
Laura, this shift at its core is about going from defending Australia as a defence policy to, you know, what Greg's talking about there. And Richard Marles has been a little more diplomatic in his language, but projecting with impact into the region. It is a significant shift, isn't it? And is it clear that we need to make that shift?
Well, that shift's sort of been going on a bit for quite a period of time, but this is a huge step up in that shift. Look, what Greg says about China is right. It's very aggressive, but exactly what the nature of the threat is has not been spelt out to the Australian public here. Now, you know, there's the sort of strategic or immediate threat seems to be this idea of war in Taiwan, possibly in 3 years' time. Now we've got Richard Marles saying it's about protecting the sea lanes. I think in all of those cases, you have to have the government telling us why it is that nuclear submarines can do that best, and does this deal actually deliver? Now, without a doubt, it's brought forward our apparent access to nuclear submarines because of the Virginia class in 10 years' time. There's a lot of window dressing in this rotation of American boats through Perth, which isn't exactly in our forward defence lines. I don't know that it's closer than anywhere else, but it makes us feel safe, I think, is the idea. And then we're getting 3 subs. What we know about submarines is that you only ever have 1 on station on average out of 3, which means we're going to have 1 nuclear sub, protecting our trade routes. Is that right? Maybe that's right. As Peter has written, it's about creating the question mark for China. Is that a big enough question mark for spending $368 billion for, at some point, getting a lot more subs down the track?
So, Peter, what is the reason for doing this?
Well, first of all, we have to break out of the traditional Australian defence game of fantasy subs, where governments make big announcements going back to, this started with the 2009 Defence White Paper under Kevin Rudd, where he said we need 12 new conventional subs, all the way through the Japanese, French options. Nothing ever happens. All we have is the same 6 conventionally powered Collins-class subs we started with. They're just 14 years older while we've been playing fantasy subs. So Australia has allowed this degrading of its submarine capability for a decade and a half. So we have to get beyond that. That's the first step. And we've yet to see that this latest thing actually becomes reality. At the moment, it's no more concrete than fantasy subs. But specifically beyond that, well, look at the country. We're an island nation that depends for all of its trade on maritime security.
That's always been the case.
That's always been the case.
So why now do we
Because the threat has increased, and the threat has increased because we have a great power that is a revisionist power that's determined to remake the world and the world's arrangements in its own interests. That power, of course, is the People's Republic of China.
And does that threat extend to us?
Well, we've seen in recent times that it was entirely prepared to put politically motivated trade sanctions on Australia. Its policy intent was described by both Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull as being hostile to Australia. So if you have a hostile great power that's prepared to use trade as a weapon of coercion against you, plus the other grey zone tactics that it's been employing, then you've got a big problem. And we have traditionally fallen back on the reassurance that we have a US ally. Well, that's as may be, but it's not entirely a reliable ally. I think anybody who's looked at US politics in recent years would understand that you're taking a big bet if you're placing, it's roulette if you're placing your national security in the hands of...
But aren't we drawing even closer into that alliance and that strategic planning of the United States by enmeshing our submarine fleets? One of the critics of this deal is also the respected strategist, the Emeritus Professor Hugh White. He spoke to Mark Kenny on his Democracy Sausage podcast and raised this issue that by doing this AUKUS deal, we're effectively agreeing to get these Virginia subs, which is a big thing for the Americans to give us. We're agreeing to join them in any conflict with China. Have a look.
The strategic context of this is that what we're going to pay for when we take delivery of American Virginia class submarines is we're not going to just pay whatever the purchase price is, and the government won't say what that is, by the way. But we're certainly going to hand over some serious dollars. Yeah. But we're also going to pay with a promise to go to war against China.
Greg, is that what we're paying with?
No, that's complete baloney. So any sub which bears an Australian flag is an Australian sub, and the government of the day can decide whatever it likes. We get F-35 Joint Strike Fighter aircraft. They're the most technically advanced fifth-generation fighter aircraft in the world. They've got 8 million lines of computer code in it. There's no one in the whole of Australia has a clue what those 8 million lines do. That doesn't mean that the Americans can secretly press a button and force the Australian Air Force to go into action. When we have a nuclear boat and it has an Australian flag, the Australian government controls it. Now,
I think Hugh White's point is for the Americans to give up. Well, they've already got a stretched industrial production line for submarines. You know, they don't have as many as they need. For them to give us 3, maybe 5, is there an expectation that we'll join them?
No, I think Hugh White is misrepresenting things less egregiously than Keating does, but nonetheless he's misrepresenting things quite substantially. We'll pay to increase the American production line, and the Americans themselves want another allied production line. So there are 4 then, 2 in America, 1 in Britain, 1 in Australia. Now, I myself don't think America could go to war to defend a Pacific democracy in Taiwan and we could stand back and do nothing. The Chinese might not allow that anyway. They'd probably attack our Pine Gap base. All of our trade would stop on day 1 of such a war. And if we won't help the Americans defend a Pacific democracy, why would they ever defend us? But having an American submarine doesn't commit a future government to anything. They can decide, if you get a future government that says the Americans are off on a crazy frolic and it's not in our interest to do it, then he doesn't have to commit an Australian boat any more than he has to commit an F-35. But mind you, 99% of our kit is American and is completely dependent on the Americans.
This is, Laura, this is the government's assurance as well, that these will be sovereign. We still decide when we're going to do anything with them, go to war, engage in a region. This is entirely Australia's decision and will remain so. Is that in any doubt?
Well, let's go back to first principles. As you said, we've basically, attached ourselves to American policy via this decision on the Virginia subs and the whole thing. I mean, we are inextricably bound up. It's not about the technology and who controls it anymore. It's about our strategic decision. We have more than ever before aligned ourselves with America. As Greg says, it's going to be very, very difficult for us not to do what they do if it comes to a conflict over Taiwan. So it almost doesn't matter what the technology is, but there is a history here of Australian naval assets in particular being used and directed by the Americans. Gareth Evans, the former foreign minister, told a story about this in Adelaide a couple of weeks ago about finding out that an Australian ship had been, during the Iraq War, had been basically directed by the Americans, and ringing up James Baker to complain about it. I mean, it's very difficult, especially when we don't have enough submariners to actually man these things as things currently stand. It's not clear to me how you have the personnel and the clear lines of delineation between our forces and the American forces that you can be that confident when you have sort of put in your bit with the Americans.
Peter, on the threat that we face, the series that you co-wrote a week or so ago, the Red Alert series in the 9 papers, we copped a fair bit of criticism for the warning that we could be facing conflict within 3 years, and suggesting various steps Australia should take, including even possibly nuclear weapons ourselves. How realistic is this sort of threat? I mean, is 3 years, is that an alarmist suggestion or is that a responsible outlook?
Well, first, just very briefly on the question of American dependency, if you're concerned about Australian excessive dependency on the US and excessive deference, I don't think the problem is technology. As Greg says, we've always been dependent on the US defence gear. It's the political psyche of the country. The Brits didn't join the Americans in the Vietnam War, an ill-begotten war. Didn't damage their alliance relationship. The Canadians didn't go to the Iraq War, it didn't damage their alliance relationship. Australia is uniquely slavish in its surrender of independent judgment when the US goes to war. So it's not the technology, it's the political psyche that's been our problem. And I would suggest to you that that's where our attention should go. If you're concerned about excessive Australian dependency. The Red Alert series that we wrote, our thinking was that we were heading towards this Defence Strategic Review, the AUKUS decision, that the government was going to monopolise the debate, and we thought we needed to throw open the debate widely, and that's what we did. We weren't looking for approval. We're not a political party seeking. We wanted to throw open the debate and get people talking and thinking about this, rather than allowing a government to monopolise this very important and very live subject. We think we succeeded. We put 5 experts in various realms of national security together, and we asked the questions, they provided the answers. We discovered very quickly, one of the very first questions we asked was, what's the outlook for the next 15, 20 years? And they very quickly and organically came to the view, the consensus view, that 15, 20 years was irrelevant to the question of our greatest threats, and that 3 years was a much more relevant time frame.
There are plenty of other experts who disagree with that.
Yes. So let's hear from the other experts, and that's what we've been doing.
But why,
so it's
why were they all on the one side?
well, they came to their own view. It was their collective
They're all
view.
hawks, though.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Also, the proposition of war in the next 3 years is not something that commentators like Peter Hartram make up. Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, said China is advancing its timeline. Admiral Gilday, Admiral Davidson, the NATO Secretary General. These are people with the best intelligence input in the world, and very sober people. Blinken is no neocon. They're saying there's a real possibility of war.
They're saying
We're
there's
not
a real
making it up.
they're saying there's a real possibility of war over Taiwan. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be at war. And Greg, let me finish.
Sure.
My point would be we have not had that debate in Australia.
I
Now,
agree we
think-
should have the debate, but the Chinese are likely to attack our facilities, Pine Gap, Northwest Cape.
Well, they might be, Greg, but my point would be, and I think it's noble of the SMAGE, if I can call you that, to want to open that discussion because we have not had it. Do we want to join? It's a really difficult question for Australia. This is not a state that we recognise, Taiwan.
No, we have a one China.
We have a one China policy, but it is a democracy. It is a very difficult question for us.
And both sides of politics prefer to stick with the strategic ambiguity answer whenever asked about this. But we'll see what we hear from Richard Marles in a moment. Paul Keating, let's just quickly touch on his. He obviously took particular issue with that series that you wrote, and with you personally, Peter. He called you a psychopath, amongst other things.
Yes.
And an acid drop.
An acid drop, yes, and a maniac.
How did that make you feel?
How did it make me feel? Well, thanks for your interest in my feelings. Like I think all of us here, I've known Keating since I first went to Canberra to report on him and the Hawke government, which was something like 36, 37 years ago now. So nothing that he says shocks or surprises me. It entertains me. One of my daughters rang up and said, because the last time she overheard a phone call where Keating was berating me, and then here's this, she rang up and she said, "Congratulations, you've been graduated from being a weasel to now being a psychopath." It's a bit of a family joke, so it's nice to get the new epithets, but it's fundamentally a recognition that Paul Keating refuses to accept that China is in any way any kind of threat or hostile actor towards
Well, indeed,
Australia.
and he made that clear in the conversation with you, Laura, at the National Press Club. And look, journalists, are pretty well used to copying a spray from former PMs and other politicians. But the Labor figures that he went after, it might be a little different for them to hear that sort of public rebuke. Penny Wong, Richard Marles, Penny Wong in particular, the line that he used around not having a foreign policy, that wandering around the Pacific with a lei around your neck is not foreign policy. How did that go down, do you think, within Labor?
Oh, well, like our colleague Phil Curry would say, like a cup of cold sick, not well. But I think without a doubt, Paul Keating's invective, basically often works against his own interests. He is at his most effective when he is advocating and explaining a position, which is why he was effective as Treasurer. When he sort of stops doing that, that's a shame. But essentially what he was doing was the same as what the Herald and the Age were doing, and they'd both be horrified to hear that, which is he's saying, what is this all about? What is the question? Now, you don't have to agree with him on that, but you have to sort of acknowledge that when he comes out and talks, whether these two think that he's talking baloney or not, people go, oh, okay, that's the question. I'm not sure that I agree with Paul Keating on this, but you know, here are these issues. What is the nature of the threat China poses? You know, it is building up. There are these assessments about Taiwan. There are these threats, you know, potentially to trade, but we haven't had those conversations.
Well, let's get into one of those conversations. Time to talk to the Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Richard Marles. And to take us there, here was Paul Keating on what he's called the worst deal in all history.
For $360 billion, we're going to get 8 submarines. Right? It must be the worst deal in all history. But let's say 360. If we were buying Collins-class replacements, we'd get at least 40 to 50 of those submarines. 40 to 50 for the same price.
Richard Marles, thanks for joining us this morning.
Morning, David. How are you?
Let's start with this basic question. Why does Australia need nuclear submarines as opposed to more conventionally powered submarines?
Well, David, the starting point of that question is that is why we need submarines. And a cursory glance at our geography, where we are, that we are an island trading nation located a long way from the places that we export our product to, means that we are really dependent upon those trading routes. And once you think that we are a country which needs to have a submarine capability, what becomes clear, not so much in 2023, but as we project through the 2030s and into the 2040s, is that the only capable long-range submarine that will be able to effectively operate is a nuclear-powered submarine. And the reason for that is because diesel-electric submarines are able to be on target for a time frame measured in days before they then have to go to the surface, recharge their batteries by using their diesel engines. That's a noisy thing to do. It's called snorting. The ability to be able to detect that is growing. It means that, if you like, the question mark that a submarine represents in an adversary's mind becomes much smaller. Whereas nuclear-powered submarines are able to be underwater for months at a time. I mean, their only limitation is really the food for the crew, and that is therefore what we're going to need to have in the future. And that's why we have to walk down this path, which is ultimately converting our 6 current diesel-electric submarines to 8 nuclear-powered submarines over the course of 30 years.
But we have always been an island. We've always been a trading nation. We've always relied on those sea lanes. How is the threat changed here? Can you be upfront with people about why we suddenly need this greater capability to defend those sea lanes, as you say?
Well, firstly, nothing sudden. I mean, this has been a debate that's been going on for a while, and as you've been talking about during the course of the morning, we're talking about acquiring this capability that the first in 10 years' time and building up the 8 over 30 years, and so nothing sudden. But there is a change in the nature of us. And this is the point that we need to think about, you know, as I've been listening to you talk this morning. I mean, one of the achievements of the Hawke-Keating government was to open up our economy and make us much more connected with the world. In 1990, trade as a proportion of our GDP was 32%. By 2020, it's 45%. You know, that's a dramatic difference. And when you break that down and look at specifics, you know, in the 1990s, we had 8 oil refineries, which were producing most of our liquid fuels onshore. Today we have 2, and most of our liquid fuels we import. Indeed, most of what we use we import from one country, and that's Singapore. So one trading route right there.
So who's threatening that trading route
of our economy? And right there, if I can just finish, right there displays a vulnerability that we need to protect.
So who's threatening that sea lane?
Well, we have seen the global rules-based order be placed under threat, obviously, in Eastern Europe, but we see it placed under threat in the Indo-Pacific as well. I mean, in the South China Sea, well, China is seeking to shape the world around it in a way that we've not seen it do, you know, prior to the last decade. And I don't say this with judgment. I think China is a great power doing what great powers do. But within the South China Sea, we've seen the creation of artificial islands. There is an idea of asserting a sovereignty which is not consistent with how we understand the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which provides for freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight. I mean, that body of water right there is a body of water through which most of our trade goes.
So is China a threat?
China itself.
Is China a threat to our sea lanes?
Well, just again, if I can just finish that point, a lot of that trade goes to China, but all of our trade to Japan, all of our trade to South Korea, 2 of our top 5 trading partners, goes through the South China Sea. Now, the only point to make here is that the maintenance of the rules-based order as we understand it, freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, is completely in Australia's interest. And we need to make sure that we have a capability which can back up that interest.
Okay.
And that's why we have to walk down the path that we are.
I just want to be clear on this because you're asking a lot of Australian taxpayers through this plan. Is China a threat to our sea lanes?
Well, as I've described, there is an assertion of a sovereignty in respect of the South China Sea, which is not consistent with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and international courts have made that point. So that we observe that. We observe the fact
that's a yes. That's a yes, is it?
But if I can finish, we observe the fact that in the year 2000, China had 6 nuclear-powered submarines. By the end of this decade, they'll have 21. In the year 2000, they had 57 surface ships. By the end of this decade, they'll have 200. Now, this is a very big military build-up.
Sounds like an arms race.
And it shapes the strategic landscape in which we live. And now in saying all of that, we want the best relationship with China that we can have, and we're working very hard to stabilise that relationship, and we value a productive relationship with China, and that is all very much the case, and the front line of our engagement with the world is our diplomacy, and we seek to pursue a much better relationship with China. But those hard power equation facts exist, and we need to be thinking about that when we're determining our own hard power equation.
You've talked about using these submarines to protect our sea lanes. Will Australia's nuclear submarines also be used to defend Taiwan?
Well, again, I've listened to the debate that you've had this morning. It really is a completely separate question.
And what's the answer to it?
What Australia... I'm not going to speculate about the future of Taiwan is the first answer, but what Australia would do or not do in respect of any future conflict will be a matter to be considered at that time by the government of the day. I mean, that is the obvious statement to make, and it's the truth. This is not about that. I mean, yes, nuclear-powered submarines have obviously the capacity to operate in the context of war, but the primary intent here is to make our contribution to the stability of the region, to the collective security of the region, precisely because when you think about how Australia operates today and the way in which we are connected with the world, and particularly with Southeast Asia and East Asia, the defence of Australia doesn't really mean much unless there is the collective security of our region and the maintenance of the rules-based order. And so we need to be understanding that's where our national interest lies. That's what we need to underpin through the shape of our defence force and the capabilities that we operate. And that's what we're doing.
Okay, but just on this point, in return for access to these Virginia-class subs, has Australia given the United States any sort of commitment, explicitly, implicitly, that we will be there in the event of a conflict over Taiwan?
The answer to that is of course not. Of course not. And nor was one sought. And I've listened to that conjecture from a number of commentators. It is just plain wrong.
So no quid pro quo here over access to these Virginia-class subs?
Absolutely not. And I couldn't be more unequivocal than that. And more than that, David, in the lead up to this announcement, I made a speech to Parliament which outlined questions of sovereignty, not just in relation to obviously the capabilities that we have within our defence force, but also in respect of the use of our continent, which made it clear that in all that we do, we maintain complete sovereignty for Australia. And I want to make it really clear that the moment that there is a flag on the first of those Virginia-class submarines in the early 2030s is the moment that submarine will be under the complete control of the Australian government of the day. And again, no one would have expected that to be any different. I mean, that is obviously the basis upon which this is happening.
In the meantime, that's 10 years away. In the meantime, we'll have visiting US and British nuclear-powered submarines in Australia on extended rotations. Now, will Australians be serving on those on board, learning the ropes? Is that the plan?
Exactly, and that's why we're doing that. So to be clear, I mean, there are Australians operating on Astutes and Virginias now,
but for these
and
ones,
actually have been for some time.
Okay, for these ones though, if they are in the coming years, in the coming decade, if that submarine is then sent into any sort of conflict, perhaps Taiwan, those Australians on board will be joining that?
Oh, well, again, in terms of Australians' engagement in any conflict, that is a separate question, and that would be determined at the time by the government of the day if there was any conflict.
But wouldn't they be under the command of the American commanding that American submarine?
Yeah, but I mean, we get into conjecture and speculation here, which I'm loath to do. So without referring to any specific conflict, if there was a point in time in the future where there was a conflict in the world, where there was the prospect of a submarine, of one of these submarines with Australians on board entering it, that is obviously going to be a matter for the government at the time.
So you could call them back, the Australians.
Well, it's not a matter of could. What Australians do in respect of any conflict is always a matter for an Australian government of the day to control, and this doesn't remove any 1 ounce of that control.
But doesn't this get to the issue around the Virginia class?
Forward.
Doesn't this get to the issue around the Virginia class subs, which will have Americans on board Australian flag vessels? Who's telling them what to do?
Well, I'm not sure why you presume that, David. These will be...
You can clear that up for us. They won't have Americans on board, these Australian flag Virginia class subs?
The submarines that we operate will be operated by Australians and be capable of being entirely operated by Australians. So let's be clear about that. Right now, we have Australians on board Virginias right now. We have Australians on board Astutes, and we have had Australians having the opportunity to operate on nuclear-powered submarines of both the UK and the US for over many years. It's possible, given that there is that arrangement, that you might have Americans on board. But the command and the control of that submarine in the future will be done by Australians. To go back to your earlier question, the point of the rotation, which is exactly right, and indeed the point of the increased tempo of visits from this day through until 2027, is precisely so that we can give our submariners an opportunity to have experiences on this platform, and then from 2027 onwards, in a much more structured way, to actually grow the submariner cohort that we will need to operate our submarines.
Just on the cost, it's a huge figure, up to $368 billion, but that lumps in everything, right, over the next 30 years. Can you just give us a bit of a more understandable breakdown? What is the Virginia-class submarine going to cost each versus the AUKUS submarine that will come down the track?
Yeah, look, you can cut these numbers in a whole lot of ways, obviously, and the reason we've put these numbers out in the way that we have is because we see this as being the most open.
But you know these numbers, though. You must know these numbers, Minister.
Well, the reason we have done it in the way we have is to give a complete cost of the capability.
Yeah. What I'm asking is the cost of the Virginia-class submarine and the cost of the AUKUS submarine. You know these figures, don't you?
I know the figures, but in a sense they become, because they become a bit arbitrary as to what you include as part of the submarine and what you include as part of the onshore component to it.
Let's just go with the submarine.
Which is why what we've ultimately done, David, is provided the all-up cost so that you get the whole thing. I mean, historically, what governments have tended to do...
But you can tell taxpayers what they're getting here. What does the submarine cost?
Well, David, again, if I can finish, that is why we're telling taxpayers exactly what they're getting and exactly what the cost is, the whole thing. Historically, what governments have done is supply and acquisition cost, like the purchase of a car, without ever talking about how much it costs to run that car. But given the nature of this capability and so much of the cost comes in the running of it, what we've done is given all of it. So
I don't know why you can't give the price of the submarine, though.
Well, we're giving the price of the submarine plus the cost of operating it because that's the honest answer.
So what is the price of the submarine?
And the question and the answer to that question is it's $9 billion for the capability over the forwards. It's between $50 to $58 billion over the course of the decade.
Yeah. And the price of the submarine?
Having this capability, over the course of its life is 0.15% of GDP.
Oh.
Now, that's against a backdrop of a defence budget which is at 2% of GDP growing to 2.2. So this is less than 10% of the defence spend. And for that, we get the most transformational capability of our defence force, a dramatic increase in our potency. This is easily, in the context of defence spends, the best value money of 0.15% that we'll spend.
And a final one, the nuclear waste here. We've already got some of the states squabbling over where it should go. You've got a bit of time to work this out, I suppose. Can I ask, are you in breach of the ALP party national platform when it comes to disposing of this nuclear waste eventually in Australia?
No, everything that we're doing is consistent with the ALP platform. Look, this is a big commitment that we've made. It forms part of being the responsible nuclear steward that we need to become, not just in terms of the disposal of the waste, but the handling of the nuclear material right through the life of it. And it is a heavy responsibility to become that nuclear steward, but a part of that is to be responsible for its ultimate disposal. It is going to require a purpose-built facility. As you said, the first reactor will be disposed of in the mid-2050s, so we have got time to get this right.
You've got the day-to-day waste, though, you'll have to deal with that in 10 years, though, won't you? The operational waste, as it's called in your documents.
Well, that is very low-level waste, which is
where will that go?
We're talking about cloths that have been used to scrub things down. So that's the kind of waste we're talking about in respect of that. But the key issue is going to be the nuclear reactors, and we do have time to. All right,
because the party platform, your ALP party platform says it says Labor will prohibit the establishment of nuclear power plants and all other stages of the nuclear fuel cycle. It also says you remain strongly opposed. The platform says you remain strongly opposed to the importation and storage of nuclear waste that is sourced from overseas in Australia.
Yeah, well, I think both of those statements go to different questions that have arisen over the years. We're not talking about establishing a civil nuclear industry, nor are we talking about opening Australia up as a repository for nuclear waste from other countries. What we're talking about here is being responsible nuclear stewards for the nuclear material that we are using for the specific purpose of naval propulsion. And it's important that as a nuclear steward we do that. As I say, we've got time to get this right, and we will.
All right, Defence Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles, thank you.
Thanks, David.
All right, let's return to our panel. We're joined once again by Greg Sheridan, Laura Tingle and Peter Harcher. Look, just a couple of things to pick up here. When it comes to explaining why we need to do this at all, Laura, do you think he went a little further there in articulating the threat that China poses? Well, certainly the argument about protecting sea lanes and trade it shouldn't be a new one, but it's a revived one, shall we say, in the last 24 hours from the Defence Minister, and I think the crucial issue here is that he was talking about is he's saying, our defence lies in the security of the region. Now, once again, that's talking about things like tensions between not necessarily us and China or China and America, but it's China and Vietnam, the Philippines, places like that, all of those day-to-day confrontations. And what role do nuclear submarines and, brackets, possibly only one, play in that? Is it that thing that Peter has articulated quite well of it being the big question mark about what exactly is going on there? But no quid pro quo over Taiwan. He made that very clear, Peter.
Yeah, that was interesting. So he did name China as the disruptive force taking territory in the South China Sea. He did talk about the Chinese military build-up. He did address pretty squarely all of those, and he did very emphatically rule out in his answer to you that there was no quid pro quo. There is no guarantee Australia would join the US in a war to defend Taiwan.
Isn't that also, though, partly based on the fact that most assessments are that if there is a war in Taiwan, over Taiwan, it will be before the Virginia-class submarines actually come into play.
This is a big point. What is the timeline with Taiwan? Well, Xi Jinping has said that he wants to complete China's so-called military modernization by 2027. The Americans say, according to the CIA, Xi Jinping has told his military to be prepared to take Taiwan by force by 2027. We will not have any of these submarines by 2027. So if in fact that timeline is correct, these will be irrelevant. The submarines will be irrelevant to any war over Taiwan.
No, but these subs that are going to be rotating in Australia, the American ones, they may well
be relevant. Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, look, we could spend hours talking submarines.
Can
and
I just add
policy.
the last point, David? Don't become obsessed with nuclear subs. If there's a war in Taiwan, I believe we will join with the Americans, and it's not dependent on nuclear subs. Our Collins subs are relevant. Every bit of American communication goes through the Pine Gap. So if the Chinese are having a fighting war with the United States, you can almost guarantee they'll missile strike Pine Gap. We would deploy F-35s, Joint Strike Fighters. We have a range of other military assets. If there's a war on Taiwan tomorrow, the same moral and political choice confronts us as would happen if it occurs in 15 years when we've got 3 or 4 nuclear subs. And my prediction is we would join in with the US, and if we didn't, the results would be even more catastrophic for us.
Let's move on. The submarines did blow everything else out of the water this week. Sorry, I'm trying to avoid submarines. Sorry.
That's a pretty lame metaphor, if I might say.
The Productivity Commission, every 5 years, the Productivity Commission lobbed this, what is it, 1,000-page report forward that is chock full of different reform ideas, big and small. And we had another one released on Friday. Laura, before we get to some of the ideas, what typically happens with these reports? Do they collect dust on the shelf, or do many of the ideas actually happen?
The ideas sort of permeate the culture, you could say, David, and you could say the reports themselves end up on the shelf, but they permeate the culture. And I think there are two things out of this 1,000-page report, which of course I've completely read and digested, but
I'll be a second reading.
But two of them are. One of the things that strikes me about them is that a lot of the things the Productivity Commission is recommending we fix are basically, you could argue, a result of previous decisions, recommendations, philosophy that the Productivity Commission pushed, including in the public sector, which it says isn't very productive. Well, I think you can argue that one of the reasons the public sector isn't very productive is because of some of the market-based things which now see lots of things, contracted out to the private sector under incredibly inefficient arrangements and very expensive arrangements. So that's just a little petty point of mine. But obviously the really interesting part of this has been what they've said about climate, which they weren't allowed to talk about 5 years ago when they last did this review.
So what they've said is the safeguards mechanism that the government's battling with the Greens to introduce, at the moment it's going to cover the biggest 215 emitters. Productivity Commission says, look, just apply it economy-wide, make every business pay essentially under this sort of scheme. Peter, could that happen over time?
It could. I'm reliably informed from people in the federal government who make these decisions that it has zero chance of happening under this government. It's effectively calling for a carbon price across the economy. That's what this would mean. And this is a government that has no interest in revisiting that lost war.
All right.
You see, and in fact, what it actually says is the most efficient way of dealing with this issue, which is a major problem for productivity that's dealing with climate change, is a single explicit carbon price. So any talk we hear from the government about wanting to do something serious about productivity, if it's not prepared to do that,
we know in reality that carbon markets have been incredibly ineffective in reducing emissions. There's a ton of research that shows carbon prices and carbon markets have had no effect. We've been talking about a carbon market in China for 15 years, and China is massively increasing its emissions every single year. This is a different Productivity Commission from the Productivity Commission of 10 years ago. Most of the things we need to do to increase productivity, like deregulating the labour market, we're actually going backwards. We're going to a pre-Keating re-regulation of the labour markets.
But on climate, I mean, it makes the point that things might be politically popular, like subsidies for electric vehicles, but they are far more costly in reducing emissions than a more broad carbon price would be. Let me just turn to the energy issues this week, though, because I just want to touch on this too. We had a warning from the regulator again that we're going to have gas shortfalls this winter and in the years ahead. Why, Greg, do we have gas shortfalls?
Well, New South Wales and Victoria, for the longest period, made it impossible to explore for gas. And so now they're demanding that Queensland give them their gas. There's a terrible schizophrenia at the heart of Australian public policy towards gas. I mean, the European Union now accepts gas as basically a clean fuel. It's much cleaner than coal. And we have constrained supply radically. Now, of course, we're exporting a lot of gas, but, you know, we only live this standard of living because we export thermal coal, gas, iron ore, all the rest of it. If you're saying on the one hand, there's Daniel Andrews saying, this is our gas, but he won't let Victoria.
Well, he has moved on some of those moratoriums. The issue now seems to be, Laura, the federal government is working out how to put a reasonable price requirement on gas companies, and they don't much like the sound of that.
Well, they don't. It's not clear to me that more supply more new supply is necessarily the answer here, but without a doubt, I think the warning from the regulator this week reminds us of that big deal announced in December last year, where there were caps put on. There was going to be corresponding legislation in the state parliaments, but at the heart of that was a discussion paper which really did propose quite extraordinary and all-consuming powers over the gas market for the federal government. Now that's still not resolved, and I think this warning this week has really shown that this issue has, not only not gone away, but not been resolved anyway 3 months later.
It's a tricky one to land, Peter.
Yeah, there's no shortage of gas in Australia. The fact is that most of it goes offshore. It's exported, and it's exported at the global price. So Western Australia doesn't have this problem because they've got a gas reservation policy. The rest of the country doesn't. So the key to resolving this question, so first that's the big stick that the federal government has to wield over gas companies. You will agree with us on this code of conduct, including reasonable pricing, or we have all these coercive powers in our hands.
They might have to use that stick. Our panel, Greg Sheridan, Laura Tingle and Peter Harcher, are going to be back shortly with some final observations. Time now, though, for Mark Humphries and Talking Pictures.
Good morning, I'm Mark Humphries from ABC's 7:30, filling in for Mike Bowers, and I'm talking pictures this morning with columnist, broadcaster, author, Academy Award winner Antoinette Lattouf. Welcome.
Hello, thank you. Look, to be honest, I only agreed to do this segment because I was assured I'd have the best hair. But looks like I was duped.
Well, you can never match me on that, but thank you. I appreciate that. Well, let's get into it, shall we? It was a week where everyone wanted to talk about underwater matters, wasn't it? We had the announcement of the AUKUS deal. Some shots here from Alex Ellinghausen.
These photos are spectacular. I mean, they look like a miss from Top Gun. I have some speculation from a really unreliable source that Joe Biden has actually just signed an influencer deal with Ray-Ban Aviators. He just hasn't figured out that they're made in China. Oh, I see. So that revelation is yet to come.
We also had this sort of round table discussion where they look like the cast of the Golden Girls. It must be very weird having these conversations with people watching on.
Yeah.
It's a bit like what we're doing now, really, actually. It was also Oscars week, and so we've got Albo by Brett Lethbridge for the Courier Mail.
Hang on, what do you mean supporting actor? And we've got Joe Biden with very excellent porcelain veneers. This was a real moment for Asian Americans, and only Australians could make it about old white men.
Kathy Wilcox in the Nine Papers has Richard Marles on the phone here to Albanese.
No, Albo, everything's fine here at home. Just wondering, should we ask for the AUKUS deal to deliver the sub sooner or for China to invade a bit later? I reckon, because I own a watch and a calendar, that if the threat of war from China is imminent, a return to serve 15 years later, a return to military serve 15 years later isn't going to cut it. And if you wonder how I know that, it's because I have a brain.
Oh, this is very Keating-esque right here. Harry Bruce here pointing out some of the, well, I suppose, budgetary targets for this AUKUS deal. What's in the firing line, potentially?
Welfare, health, NDIS, environment, education, tax cuts. I mean, little Nemo here feels like every taxpayer for the next 30 years, just freaking out because this really is an assault on all of those services.
Baju Chow in 9 Papers with quite a striking image here, again with the Chinese saying, "You undermine peace in the region," and Albo's got his little toy boat.
Well, I do think that this juxtaposition is a little bit unfair. Like, firstly, if we've got enough money to spend $368 billion on submarines, surely we can afford to give Albo a high-quality wetsuit. Because I don't buy that. And also, our little AUKUS submarine, I mean, it's intact because we don't know how to. We don't know what to do with it.
We don't know what to do these things. It wasn't nuclear powered, but we did get a weapons-grade blast from the past this week. This was extraordinary. Antoinette, did you watch Paul Keating at the National Press Club?
I watched it, and it was the most entertaining moment in Australia's modern political history.
John Kudelka in the Saturday paper has Keating as a sort of Godzilla figure.
Yeah, a sea monster with the submarines inside.
I mean, Keating is sort of like a beast that sort of emerges every few months. It's usually, when you hear the word superannuation, you hear sort of a there's a rumbling as Keating arrives.
Eats everything in his sight.
David Rowe in the Fin Review with his traditionally flattering take on things. And we've got remnants of the previous proposals. We had the French flag, which is sinking there. We've even got Abbott Speedo's return. They'll never go.
We have the remnants of the Anglosphere, which we're desperately hanging on to and continuing to forget or pretend that we don't exist in the continent of Asia.
Well, thank you very much for joining me this morning, Antoinette. I'll let you do the honours.
It is back to you, David.
Thank you, Antoinette. Thank you, Mark. Let's get some final observations. To you first, Peter.
Well, this week, David, has been the 20th anniversary of the start of the Iraq War, the Iraq invasion. At this moment of high celebration with the Australia-US alliance, I think that anniversary should be a sobering reminder for us to apply independent, prudent judgment to any US decision about war in the future.
Good point. Laura.
Well, speaking of big question marks, I just wanted to note that according to the Navy website this morning, the Australian Navy Order of Battle has the 6 Collins-class submarines listed on it, along with all the surface ships and other assets. None of the submarines have a commanding officer listed. 2 of them are in dry dock, but none of them have a commanding officer. Now, maybe the Navy's been too busy to just update its website, but it raises the question of where are they all and what are they doing? The submarines. The submarines, not just the commanding officers.
Yeah, exactly. A recruitment ad has started today on that front, so they've got to get cracking. Greg.
So, David, I think the subs raise a profound question of national identity in this way. When we talk about national projects over the last 10 years, what we're normally talking about is new and clever ways to spend money on ourselves. You know, if you're a red-headed Scotsman, you get a special grant and so on. Everything we call a national reform is just spending money. This project is building the most complex artefact the human race has ever devised. Are we still up to that? That's a great question for Australia.
Well, it is. We'll see. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Should also mention we're in the final week now of the New South Wales election campaign, and next Sunday morning we'll be coming to you with Insiders Live from Sydney after our election night coverage on Saturday night. Looking forward to that. Finally, it was a very busy week for Richard Marles, but he did find some time to catch up with his old sparring partner, the former Defence Minister, Christopher Pyne. Inevitably, the conversation was dominated by submarines and a term we're all becoming familiar with, snorting. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Yeah, so if you look at 2005, it was possible in those days to go off and kind of snort behind a bush while you went back and then did your thing.
Not on Oxford Street, Darlinghurst.
Okay, we're trying to be serious.
Yeah, no, sure.
I knew this was an occupational hazard, having Christopher do this, but anyway.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.